It is now my pleasure and my honor to introduce our first speaker, Lieutenant General retired Jack Shanahan. He recently retired from active duty from the Air Force, where his final assignment was the director of the DoD Joint Artificial Intelligence Center, otherwise known as the JAIC. While in the military, he held several positions involving intelligence, policy, and operational roles. He was the first director of Project Maven, where he led the DoD's program of bringing AI to intelligence disciplines. Jack serves on many boards and special commissions and on several advisory boards and with academic and industrial groups. Currently, he is proud to be a graduate student in international studies at North Carolina State University. Jack, thank you for leading off our colloquium today with the title, The Operationalization of AI, Diffusion of Innovation, and the Lessons Learned from Two DoD AI Startups. Thank you, Jack.
Thank you very much, Dan, and also thanks to Joe and Karen. It's an honor for me to be presenting today and to lead this off. I'm going to start by being mildly provocative, by questioning the use of revolution in the title Revolution in Intelligence Affairs. In general, we only perceive revolutions in hindsight, and professional historians are usually called upon to declare more precisely when and how one happened. Using the term revolution also tends to make people tune out. Think, for example, of the salvation promised, yet not fully delivered through the Revolution in Military Affairs, or RMA, over 30 years ago. With that opening salvo, however, I don't hesitate for a moment in asserting that AI will change in fundamental ways the character, though not the nature, of intelligence analysis and the character of warfare. And we are already beginning to see the outlines of how it can do so. History is a tale of very long periods of continuity and short, sharp shocks or discontinuities. Indeed, history and technology share S-curve similarities. It feels to me like we're approaching the point at which the slope of the AI technology curve, and perhaps even the history S-curve itself, will begin to steepen exponentially. For that reason, I contend that agencies and organizations across the United States government face about a 5-year window to inculcate a culture of innovation or risk the inability to keep pace with the implications and ramifications of emerging and disruptive technologies. Absent major changes, the combination of legacy systems, legacy workflows, lack of a data-centric culture, and failure to appreciate the magnitude of organizational, cultural, policy, and technical retooling required for the information age is a recipe for disaster. There are dire consequences of getting this wrong, up to and including the possibility of losing one key component of the strategic competition with China. The IC has held certain advantages over the Department of Defense in terms of shifting from a hardware-centric industrial age organization to a software-centric information age, more risk-tolerant one. That's mostly the result of the nature of the intelligence business. And I realized that eyesight generated a lot of emotions across the IC over the past few years, running the gamut from loathing to mere discontent. Yet eyesight was important, and that was a vital first step in addressing the massive technical debt that was incurred across the IC over the past 30 years or so. And by the way, the DoD faces an even greater technical debt problem. Yet there is still so much more to be done in the IC. And as to the desired trait of greater risk tolerance, I think we could all agree that the IC has generally fallen short. In fact, the National Security Commission on AI's final report, which was just released a couple of months ago, underscores the importance of changing IC risk management practices to accelerate new technology adoption, balancing technical risk against the substantial operational risk that would result from not keeping pace. With those as preambulatory comments, I intend to provide a good 20 minutes for Q&A after my remarks, but I caution you that to avoid distraction, I'm not going to look at the Q&A box until I get to that point. For those of you who are not already familiar with my background, as I say with tongue only partially in cheek, I was the CEO of two AI startups in the Department of Defense, Project Maven, which was centered entirely on fielding AI-enabled capabilities across the defense intelligence enterprise, and the JAIC, which was tasked to cover all other non-intel missions in the DoD. As conceited as that title might sound, it actually reflects what I did for the 5 years before I retired just a year ago. I worked very closely with Dean Solelis, and Dean, of course, talked at colloquium #1 and the entire AIM iHub team across the IC throughout my entire tenure in Maven and in the JAIC. It is accurate to say that Dean and I were philosophically aligned at every step of the journey. Though we worked diligently to join forces wherever possible, it was the congenital nature of the extremely large bureaucracies known as the DoD and the IC to diverge occasionally, requiring periodic intervention by both of us to ensure we were learning from each other and not duplicating efforts. I know that as much as I felt like every day was hand-to-hand combat standing up the JAIC, Dean faced an even tougher uphill battle in bringing AIM and the iHub to fruition. Primarily, I think, because of the differences between the Secretary of Defense's ability to issue policy and budget direction and D&I's constraints as the head of the sprawling and occasionally unruly IC that often resulted in issuing less explicit guidance. I don't want to replow tilled ground, so in terms of framing, I will simply reiterate why we stood up Project Maven and then using the lessons learned from that experience while I was asked to establish the JAIC, to bring AI-enabled solutions across the DoD at speed and at scale. Speed and scale. Based on the concept of a centralized foundation at the OSD level and decentralized development experimentation in the services, the combatant commands, and in the field. If you accept the premise that the big innovation engines are turning faster across DoD and the IC, what next? As I see it, at this point, the only way to go big and go fast is to move beyond disruption to focus on reimagining and reinvention, addressing 5 central concepts that will result in fielding AI-enabled capabilities at speed and scale. First, inculcating a startup and agile culture across the institutional bureaucracy, or what I call the diffusion of innovation across the IC and DoD. Second, organizational adaptation to match the changes in the information age world around us. Third, new operating concepts that incorporate a hybrid of legacy and leading edge technologies. Fourth, obsessive customer or end user focus. And finally, a new approach to education and training at every level. Note that I mentioned technology only peripherally in that list. I realize that it's becoming somewhat of a cliche to say this today, but I am convinced that technology is no longer the hardest part of the puzzle. The kind of tech the IC needs is already largely available in commercial industry. It can be adapted to DoD and IC needs, and it is reasonably inexpensive compared to big boutique in-house solutions. Instead, the real challenge for both DoD and the IC is innovation adoption, which in turn is entirely dependent upon all of the 5 elements that I just mentioned. If you have not yet read the National Security Commission on AI final report, I urge you to do so. If nothing else, read the first 18 pages, Chapter 5, which is titled AI and the Future of National Intelligence, and the associated blueprint for action for Chapter 5. Chapter 5 begins with a statement that I would like to claim some influence in writing, that intelligence will benefit from rapid adoption of AI-enabled technologies more than any other national security mission. I agree. AI/ML is, after all, optimized to find signals and noise and to deal with massive amounts of information that humans simply cannot process effectively. The report calls for an AI-ready IC by 2025. That is a bold, ambitious goal indeed. It also highlights the major hurdles that could stymie efforts to reach that goal. The report notes that, quote, critical barriers in authorities, policies, budgets, data sharing, and technical standards keep the IC from fully realizing its potential, end quote. How those barriers are knocked down will depend on leadership at every level, and I'll come back to this. I want to quote one paragraph from the report in its entirety because it hits at the heart of so many important ideas about an AI-enabled force for the IC. Quote, starting immediately, the IC should prioritize automating each stage of the intelligence cycle to the greatest extent possible and processing all available data information through AI-enabled analytic systems before human analyst review. Products should also be disseminated at machine speed, which means they must also be in machine-readable formats. And systems across the IC must be able to ingest and use them without manual intervention. Optimizing AI-enabled systems in this way will require an entirely different approach to the creation and review of finished intelligence products. The IC should require that all intelligence products include both a human-readable version and, just as important, an automated machine-readable version that can be ingested into other analytic systems throughout the IC. All future intelligence systems should be optimized for AI-oriented data collection and processing. End quote. I couldn't have said it any better. The NSCAI final report makes one other recommendation that I endorse most enthusiastically, namely that the DNI should, in coordination with the Secretary of Defense, immediately issue a directive designating the PD-DNI as a standing member and/or co-chair to a proposed tri-chair steering committee on emerging technology, which should comprise the Deputy Secretary of Defense, the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the PD-DNI. As omnipotent as Dean and I might have liked to pretend we were, having the Pentagon and IC represented at the very most senior levels on an emerging technology tri-chair steering committee is crucial to ensuring that the DoD and the IC remain closely aligned as they both move towards this AI-enabled future. The two cultures may differ substantially, but there's no reason whatsoever why DoD and the IC should diverge much at all when it comes to adoption and integration of emerging and disruptive technologies. Before I close out with some points related to the diffusion of innovation, I want to highlight a few other important lessons learned from my Maven and Jake experiences that are directly applicable to the IC. First, mission relevancy. Always, always, always prioritize product over process. That can be a challenge when the IC as we know it today was, in all honesty, mostly formed around process. Process has a place in any large bureaucracy, of course, but the moment process begins to dominate product, you've lost the battle, if not the war. Not much kept me up at night when I was standing up to Jake because I was always so damn exhausted, but I admit I had occasional night tremors at the thought of the Jake turning into another large bureaucratic organization, one that would become more concerned about its own growth and self-protection than in driving AI-enabled solutions at speed and at scale. Next, one of the biggest leaps in understanding for me personally, as well as for everyone else in Maven and the Jake, came from gaining a newfound appreciation for product development and product management, not project management, product management. Completely second nature to anyone in the leading edge tech world today and to people like Dean, but a foreign concept to most of the DoD and I suspect to most of the IC as well. Product development includes an obsession on the customer experience, UI, UX, along with continuously incorporating user feedback, from design through fielding a minimal viable product and follow-on sustainment through continuous integration, continuous delivery. We learned a lot the hard way in the early days of Maven, and then again when standing up the Jake. We just did not have people with the right background and right experience in those areas. That changed the moment Nand Mulchandani stepped into the CTO role at the Jake. Nand had over 26 years of experience in Silicon Valley and not a single day in government, which was, as far as I was concerned, a distinct advantage. Every day I spent with Nand was a master's class in product management, platform design, the concept of leverage to drive scale, and software engineering principles. Product management quickly became one of our top focus areas, along with standing up cross-functional or integrated product teams, similar to what we had done in Maven. While AI is truly a team sport, Nand proved to me once again the inestimable value to any new organization of bringing in the right person into the right job at the right time. Third, I gained a new appreciation of the importance of understanding and building towards a future of human-machine teaming. a concept as important to the IC as in any other discipline, and probably even more so. The NSCAI final report states that the IC must develop innovative human-centric approaches to human-machine teaming. I was privileged to read early inputs on this topic from Gilman Louie. For those of you who don't know or know of Gilman, he is one of the National Security Commission on AI commissioners. He's a remarkable individual, known for a lot of different things, to include his video game design success. He developed the F-16 Fighting Falcon flight simulator, and he licensed Tetris from its developers in the Soviet Union. I have a lot of time on the Tetris machine. Also, his incredible run as a venture capitalist, and of some interest to the people in this audience, the fact that he was the first CEO of In-Q-Tel. Here is what Gilman said about human-machine teaming. My long-term view: machines don't have to mimic human thinking and reasoning in order to achieve generalized intelligence. In fact, machines thinking like machines and humans thinking like humans could lead to the best results if we can solve the human-AI teaming problem. Translating sensing data into human understanding might make the problem harder to solve. Machine common sense can be different than human common sense, especially if we can remove typical human-generated bias based on a worldview which can be caused by a human version of the horizon effect that limits understanding of the problem and potential solution set. I would use teaming model because how we team with autonomous systems and AI may not be on a peer level or a bait, but organized around optimizing systems performance by appropriate teaming and division of labor between algorithms, machines, and humans. End quote. Those are powerful and insightful words and an excellent point of departure given their extensive applicability across the entire IC. Okay, so I want to close now by talking about how innovation diffuses across large bureaucracies. I became deeply interested in this topic based on my Maven and Jake experiences, as well as the influence of a public policy course I took at NC State last fall. And it's true, I did go back to grad school after retiring. First, why should we care? What's the problem? Is there even a problem? Well, how many self-declared innovation organizations have sprouted across the government in the past few years? I can list a dozen without even trying hard. Typically, these have been small organizations or sub-organizations led by unique disruptive personalities, and the organizations have been almost entirely dependent upon those unique personalities. They comprise relatively few hand-picked people. They focus on limited numbers of small-scale pilot projects or prototypes. They may or may not have support from above and buy-in from below. They make a very big and very deserved splash. Yet the results they achieve can almost never scale across large bureaucracies without major changes through parent organizations and agencies. If that's the diagnosis, then what's the prescription? Well, unfortunately, it's not as simple as just adding more cowbell. The recipe for sustained and measurable progress for large organizations requires the following people-centered ingredients, not technology-centered, people-centered ingredients, and you need all of them in the right proportion. First, a small number of classic change agents or disruptors. Second, bottom-up innovators. It was increasingly apparent to me before I retired that there are more than sufficient numbers of people in those first two categories. Third, leaders who can provide top-down pressure, top cover, advocacy, oversight, and who are capable of making the necessary resource commitments. In other words, strong and effective leaders who focus less on innovation and more on innovation adoption. Fourth, you need essential bureaucrats. That's in the positive sense of the word, the kind of people who know how the system works and who also know how to work the system. Fifth, you must bring in transplanted leaders from a commercial tech industry and academia, like Dean as the AIM iHub lead and Nan Mulchandani as the Jake CTO. It's hard to find people like this, but it's not impossible. And the good news is you don't need too many of them because the return on investment is so high for each one. Six, you must win over the real opinion leaders throughout an organization. The person who literally wrote the book on the diffusion of innovation, Everett Rogers, defined opinion leadership as the degree to which an individual is able to influence other individuals' attitudes or over behavior informally in a desired way with relative frequency. Contrary to popular opinion, these are not the disruptors. The disruptors have their own special role. Instead, they are people typically found in the middle layers of all organizations. Middle management. Typically the most maligned element of any bureaucratic ecosystem, sometimes even pejoratively referred to as the frozen tundra. And yet, the people in this layer of an organization invariably reflect priorities as promulgated from above and as advocated for from below. They can indeed become risk averse, usually because of a whipsaw effect from the combination of seemingly continuous leadership changes above them, the lack of empowerment or trust, and good old-fashioned self-preservation. Middle management is critical to large-scale diffusion of innovation, more so, in fact, than any other ingredient in the recipe to innovation success. They determine whether or even when the slope of the innovation diffusion S-curve increases steeply or remains perpetually flat. As Everett Rogers said, after the opinion leaders in a system adopt an innovation, it may be impossible to stop its spread. Who then provides the critical spark of innovation? Who are the people who can successfully blend all the ingredients in the recipe of innovation? Leaders who place the appropriate emphasis on and who are the strongest possible advocates for developing and sustaining a culture that allows innovation to thrive. They make explicit resource commitments and take positively reinforcing personnel actions to include an intense focus on hiring practices. They provide top cover and advocacy, empowering people at every level while establishing inviolable core priorities and setting high standards. Such leaders adhere to organization-wide innovation adoption principles. They treat middle management as true opinion leaders and key participants in the diffusion of innovation rather than as obstacles to be removed or circumvented. They trust the people around them, and the people around them trust them. And they not only accept a risk-tolerant attitude, they insist on it. They also insist on ensuring sufficient education and training for everyone in an organization, to include themselves, on innovation, entrepreneurship, agile principles, product development, risk management, and so on. Once the innovators and change agents at lower levels see firsthand that the environment above them supports their efforts, and the opinion leaders observe the tangible results of the innovators' labors, then the virtuous cycle of innovation begins to thrive and innovation ecosystem flywheels start connecting. The focus begins to shift towards broad technology adoption and integration rather than what I would call unhealthy and sometimes misplaced obsession on the term innovation. Or, alternatively, absent one or all of these ingredients, change agents and innovators will vote with their feet, forever disillusioned about the IC's relevancy in the digital age, while middle layer opinion leaders never have the opportunity to flourish. There is no question that the IC faces a daunting journey ahead to make the epochal shift from an industrial age, hardware-centric enterprise to an information age, software-centric, user-focused, more risk-tolerant one. It will take years to play out with a transition period that will call for creative marriages between legacy systems and leading-edge disruptive technologies. It also demands finding and maintaining the right balance between tactical urgency and strategic patience. Admittedly, not everyone will adapt. One of the hard parts of leadership is understanding when it's time to move the people in this category to where they are better suited, or even when it's time to just let them go. There's been impressive progress just over the past couple of years in improving the partnerships between government, industry, and academia. But even more so than for the DoD, the IC still faces serious challenges in restoring trust with the commercial tech industry. That's a big area that has to be worked on by everybody. Finally, the phrase, a culture of innovation in the institutional bureaucracy, does not have to be an oxymoron. The challenges the IC faces, while formidable, are all surmountable. The last thing I will say, and it might have come across as a little squishy, is that I cannot overstate the importance of forging unity of vision, a common meta-narrative, as the IC moves towards this AI-enabled metaverse future. It is a big, tough lift, but the ideas of unity, along with palpable excitement about the future, are essential to implementing all of those weighty recommendations in the National Security Commission on AI's final report. So as I get ready to kind of engage in Q&A here, so please put your questions in the box. I do want to make one final recommendation. If you get a chance, please go out and read Noah Smith's June 22nd interview with Mark Andreessen. It's on Noah's Substack. Andreessen offers fascinating insights on software. And he says, yes, software is still eating the world and will do so for at least another decade. Also on techno-optimism, new forms of social media such as Clubhouse and Substack, crypto, China, and finally AI, where he strongly prefers that the A in AI should stand for augmented, not artificial. And I will say that Dean had this right a long time ago in the IC. Okay, with that said, those are sort of my prepared remarks. We have lots of time here, and I'll start heading into the Q&A. So just give me a second to pull it up. I know this first question looks like it's for a panel, so I think that one is for the panel. Okay, this one more for me. Active duty captain pursuing a PhD in information technology. Question is, regarding machine common sense and human common sense, will you willing to expand on what machine common sense is and compared to human common sense? I ask through a human resource information systems lens, as I feel they're extreme areas of growth in our Air Force HRIS practice. That's a great question. I don't have a really great answer. Again, I was quoting Gilman on that. So I think what we have had a habit of doing for a long time, as we have started down this journey of AI and ML, is trying to make everything that a machine produces fit for a human. What Gilman's getting at is that there are machine tailored solutions and human tailored solutions, and you shouldn't try to force one into the other. So the idea of whatever we want to define machine common sense as, let's leave it as machine common sense and not try to take results coming from a machine and say, well, I'm going to put this in my what I would call common sense. So I think it's more of let the machines be optimized for what they do. I'll give one, I'm not sure it's the best example, but it's one that we live very, very practically in Project Maven, whereas the sensor for one of the platforms, the wide area motion imagery sensor, had a resolution that was only as good as the best human could ever get. They didn't need to make it better because it was optimized for humans. Once we started looking at putting artificial intelligence against the take from that sensor, it wasn't good enough. The whole sensor has to be redesigned to incorporate AI and ML from the very beginning. Leave the human out of it until the human needs to be in the equation. I think part of what Gilman's saying is let each do what they do very well on their own, and then take the outputs of machines, use what humans do best, which is always going to be place context into this. Use human reasoning to be able to understand what the context is. What are the ethical principles I need to think about? What is responsible AI? What are the legal implications of this, right? Machines aren't very good at doing that. Machines are that sort of that rules plus way of working right now. So I think, if I could encourage you to do something, Alexis, it's maybe go down this line of questioning a little bit more in your studies and say, if we were to try to define machine common sense, is there such a thing? Or is that just a crazy term to begin with? But I think that's not, Gilman was saying more about just let the machines do what the machines do best. Don't try to take their solutions and force feed it into a human comprehension of the world. We're going to see the world differently. We're going to understand it differently. So let's optimize what we each do best and make the product of that a more effective solution. For me personally, it's a little dated by now, but when I started on that first days of the Maven journey and trying to understand where we were going, the best book I read at the time, which is really the first book I read on AI, was Kasparov's Deep Thinking. and it took him years to get over that visceral impact of losing to the machine. But once he did, I don't know if you'll find anybody that's more encouraging about humans, machines working together. It's take the grandmaster or even a decent, not grandmaster chess player, and pair them with a machine and add superior processes, and they beat everybody else, right? It's the machine plus superior process plus what humans do really, really well, and put those together, and you're going to beat anybody in the game of chess. So I think that, to me, is the breakthrough, is understanding what we even mean by human-machine teaming. So it's a really good question. I'm giving you a half of an answer, I think, but I would ask you to sort of pursue this a little bit, because it will generate, I think it'll generate some very wildly different reactions. Just the word machine common sense will turn a lot of people off by saying there is no such thing. Okay, well, let's talk more about that. Back to what is the Turing machine? What is the Turing test? Is there this gets into a whole different, almost a philosophical subject, back to what I would call the beginnings of AI in the philosophy departments of places like Edinburgh, rather than in the sort of computer science departments. So I hope that helps a little bit. All right, Kevin Sullivan, University of Virginia. Procurement policies, practices, and culture continue to remain rooted in old-style waterfall development. Hallelujah, you're right. Where what is to be built is known in advance, and all the rest are implementation details. However, this is not how software-intensive systems have developed. Far more agile, adaptive, continuous uncertainty, reducing experimentation. How should DoD and IC address the continuing dominance of old-fashioned systems engineering, ontology, and methodology? This is a really, really good question. It cuts at so much of the culture part of this. I say we learned so much because we didn't know what we were doing in those first few months of Project Maven. Rapidly adapted to go exactly what you're talking about. I would sit in the offices of Defense Innovation Board for hours at a time with people like Josh Marcuse explaining what agile really meant, right? Not agile waterfall, which some people were telling the DIB that they were doing agile, and of course they were not at all. It was sort of the waterfall style. So it took us a long time to understand what it even meant. What is software engineering principles? What is the Agile Manifesto? And I dove into that. I don't claim that I'm an expert on any of it, but I do have a much better understanding now than I ever did 4.5, 5 years ago. We started down this journey, and there are a lot of people that do understand it well. So this gets back to the culture and leadership, right? This is a technology issue, but it's not a technology issue. This is a culture issue of having leadership that understand things need to be done differently and get at it in a different way, right? You're not going to build a satellite right now completely using sort of, agile, although I would suggest some of the commercial small satellites are being done that way. But there's a difference between an aircraft carrier or a submarine versus sort of software. It's finding what works, for the right problem at the right time. So the more we understood what Agile was all about, the more we adopted it. The idea of minimal viable product was so important to us in handing an initial product over to the user and telling them exactly what they were getting, right? Not trying to tell them, here's a perfect answer, because it was never perfect. In some cases, we would tell them up front, you're getting a 65% solution. It's the best we can do right now, but we'd rather have you use it and tell us what's wrong with it and get better, and we'll make it better and better and better and get quicker and quicker at it. That was the Maven philosophy and is the Maven philosophy. We were trying to make it that same philosophy in the Jake. That gets to that obsessive focus on end user engagement. UI, UX. Boy, I learned a lot about how big tech companies do UI, UX. It is so different than anything the DoD or probably even the IC is used to doing. The idea of sitting side by side, literally side by side with users and getting their feedback and then making the product better. And also at the same time, taking real world data in and making the algorithms perform better based on that data. So UI, UX plus sort of continuous integration, continuous delivery. So we did a lot. One of my biggest emphasis areas when I stood up the Jake was acquisition and contracting. I stood up a branch just for that. Maven, our team was so small, we took what we had and they were good at acquisition and contracting, but we needed a lot of outside help. We made a lot of progress in the Jake. We had some just fierce advocates of getting this right. You can see it through things like the Tradewin contract, which is now a much more broader, open-ended contracting vehicle where there is sort of this overarching owner of the vehicle, but all these other companies can come under that umbrella. That's just part of it. Congress, very helpful in this. There are some staffers on the Hill who could not have been more supportive of going after the acquisition and contracting piece of this. So I think what you've got to do, Kevin, to get sort of to the bottom line, is show results and show the difference between waterfall and agile. And it's night and day. It's just until somebody sees it for real, it's a little hard for some people to grasp it. So show that it works, and then have the advocates. It's what I talked about. You need the change agents, the disruptors, but left to themselves, they're just going to disrupt, and people are going to treat them as glass breakers, and that crazy person sits over in the corner and don't touch what they're doing. That's not going to work, right? You've got to have a combination of the disruptors and the innovators and the people that understand this new way of doing acquisition and contracting, that understand Agile Manifesto, that say waterfall doesn't work in this world. So it's a combination of all those different things. It's not at its core a technology problem. It is a cultural problem. So from Brent Potter, who's my classmate at NC State, he got out of the Marines last year and also going to the same program. Do you view bureaucratic competition or societal fears about AI as the biggest barrier to successful implementation of DoD? Yeah, this one drives me honestly a little batty, because there is a cottage industry in getting to the worst case solution of killer robots. I hate even saying those two words because it's so far removed from what we're working on. I used to say, and not at all trying to be facetious, I say, if you really think killer robots are the problem, let me come show you what we're doing in Project Maven. And in those early days, you're going to be underwhelmed because we were at such a nascent stage of this. But it's a good industry for a lot of people to talk about that scenario and paper clips taking over the world. I'll let the philosophers argue about that with the technology experts. I didn't think about that day to day because we were just trying to put solutions into the field that would make somebody's life a little bit better, either in intelligence enterprise or in sort of operations on the warfighting side. Bureaucratic competition, it's there. I think there's been so much of a emphasis on doing things differently across both the DoD and the IC that, yeah, there's always going to be bureaucratic competition, but in some cases, bureaucratic competition actually stimulates better results. Sort of, hey, did you see what the AMI hub just did? You know, we got to push harder in the Jake, and I hope vice versa. So, you know, competition is good. Bureaucracies generally are bad, with the exceptions that I talked about. How do you make innovation diffuse in large bureaucratic organizations? It is not at all a trivial thing. I mean, it takes a lot of hard work to get this stuff to happen. So I put societal fears in a different corner than bureaucratic competition. I think we just, you tackle bureaucracy. On the societal fears, there are plenty of people looking at that at the long term. As we always used to say, the reason we stood up for the Jake was AI now. We let R&E talk about AI next, and there are lots of people thinking about AI next. General Shanahan referred to a NOAA interview. National Ocean. I don't know what I referred to. NOAA, I have to think about it. Now, you bring up NOAA, it's the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Agency. I love what that agency is doing in AI. Is it oriented differently than most of the Department of Defense's work? Yes, but a lot of it was very fungible. Some of the work they're doing in climate change, in tracking whales or dolphins, using acoustics to track whales, for example, using machine learning, it's really exciting work. And some of it was cutting edge. Now, it's a different, they're doing it for very different purposes, but it was nice to see their approach to it. And I hope it's still as embraced as it seemed to be about 1.5 years ago, when we would come together at these meetings in the White House on the AI Select Committee, because I tell you, I was impressed by what NOAA was doing in that. I'll have to go back and look at my notes. I was not referring to NOAA, but I may have used some other acronym that I didn't explain. Okay. From Georgia Tech, Professor Maggie Kozel. What are you doing to champion the kind of people and implicitly teams you cite as critical? Oh, boy, this is it, right? When I talk culture, I'm also talking people. Oh, sorry. Yeah, thank you for somebody corrected me. It was not NOAA. It was Noah Smith. Noah Smith is he's on a Substack platform right now. He does interviews. So Noah Smith, June 22nd interview with Mark Andreessen. Yeah, the kind of people, this is, culture and people, of course, are the same sides of the coin, right? You've got to, you don't change culture without having sort of people adopt and embrace different style of culture. So there was a lot that we were doing in the JAG to just change hiring practices, period. It was a battle. It was an uphill battle. Again, I will point to the Hill in the most bipartisan issue I've ever seen in my entire military career. They were more than willing to try to help us, but sometimes we would get in our own way. And I'll just say that we had one proposal that would boost the pay, significantly boost the pay of a limited number. I think the number was 20 people to bring them in specially designated science and technology positions. We thought it would sail through. OMB stopped it. Who knows what politics were going on behind the scenes? They said, well, we want to see proof that your previous initiatives have worked. That is bureaucracy at its worst. I'm sorry. I can say that now. I'm beholden to nobody, but I never understood that. It was flabbergasted. We fought it, we appealed it, and we lost the appeal. Congress was sitting with thumbs twirling, saying, "Show us what you got." These are the kind of things that will really stop progress. So it's hiring practices at every level. Not everybody needs to come in and demand $450,000 as a starting salary. Once in a while, you will find somebody that needs to be paid that much to keep them from going somewhere else like Google, Amazon, Microsoft, or whatever. But it's not just at that level. It's at every level of every civilian agency, the IC and DoD. And it's doing education and training differently on these principles that I've talked about in my remarks, from the time they get their initial training all the way until they're getting advanced training 25, 30 years down the road as senior executives. So there's a lot that the JAIC has done to do an analysis of what the archetypes need to be for different parts of the AI ecosystem pipeline, right? In some cases, an AI ethicist is as important as a software engineer. They have different roles in the JAIC, but they're each advancing the cause of AI across the DoD, and likewise for the IC, right? I don't think there's any doubt that you have to go at this deliberately. I mentioned the word that these leaders need to be very deliberate in their hiring decisions. It was hard for me at the beginning because the services gave me who the services gave me. If you were standing up a tech organization, a software company in Silicon Valley, you would hand pick your first 10. The 10 would bring in their 10. The 20 would become 40. The 40 become 100, and so on. We didn't have that luxury. I would be the first to admit it. I wasn't necessarily the technical expert on any of this stuff. So until I had a CTO come in, as I say, in many ways, my most important hire in my tenure at the JAIC. So it's all of this coming together, but it is tackling education and training differently. It is doing hiring, practicing differently. Cyber's gone through similar growing pains when people would leave a cyber assignment and go back to something that had nothing to do with cyber. Well, that wasn't necessarily helpful. So it's I know the services have their needs, but we have to be a little bit more deliberate. And because I'd rather see if I can get to more questions, I'll keep going on here. The power of AI to mitigate human bias. What do you say to people who've argued that some form of human bias would live on because humans are doing the coding? Greta Creech, I couldn't agree more. I could not agree more. We're humans, right? I actually don't like the term that algorithms are biased. No, it's an algorithm. It's the human that's biased who's building the algorithm. Whether or not it's implicit bias or explicit bias, it's bias. It's based on their background, their experiences. It's where the data comes from. The data is data. Whether or not the data reflects a certain slant of something, well, that's, I don't quite call that bias. It's just play the ball as it lies. That is the data. You have to play it the way you get it. So we have to be incredibly cautious, with many tales of danger signals coming from commercial industry and academia right now, where this has gone horribly wrong, whether it's in hiring, recruiting, whatever, based on data sets that were flawed in the fact that, well, we hired 50 years worth of white senior executives, really not going to help us in machine learning if that's who it's going to pick for the future. This has to be something you constantly pay attention to, constantly. We'll never get to the point where I fully trust machines in this area, because you make the point that humans are doing the coding. And somehow we might need coding to review coding to make sure that there's a double, triple look at what's going on. Can we ever expect that AI will reduce IC labor demand? Seems like AI just adds jobs and labor costs in IC. A different trajectory is promised for industry. Yeah, I'm not, I sort of will come at it maybe just a slight different view than the way you phrased it. It will repurpose people. Repurpose, the jobs are not going away. We learned very quickly from Project Maven that it makes certain elements of an analyst job better. I'd say easier, but better mostly is what we were focused on. So they don't sit and look at a full motion video screen for 15 hours at a time. There's plenty of work to go around, as I think Davey's going to talk about. Just look at open source explosion. It's gone crazy in open source. We're going to get very creative about what we're looking for in different sources of intel. All it does, though, is add more data to the problem. So we need better solutions to use our humans better and let the machines get through that volume of information which humans just cannot process. So I think it's going to be about repurposing. There are lots of scare stories right now about losing jobs to automation. I think some are natural. Every single technology in history has dealt with this in a similar manner. From the Industrial Revolution to the information age. There are some differences, but there are some core historical analogies to be had here. And that is, humans will do things differently. It doesn't mean the labor goes away. In sub jobs, trucking, long distance trucking on straight, flat highways for 400 miles, guaranteed. Machines can do that fairly well, but with some restrictions. Psychologists, psychiatrists, not going to get a machine to do that right now. So for the IC, I think it's fine. This is going to take a little bit of work to understand where those human-machine teams can be optimized and what we really need the humans for, to sit back, as I say, to sit back a layer above or 2 layers above and do what the humans do best, which is reasoning and context, which, back to the previous point, is also subject to bias. So we have to be very careful about bias regardless of how much the machines are doing. Giulio, to support your point, is the late John McCarthy, of course, 1956 AI conference, famously observed, algorithms are unlikely to be endowed with common sense, hence the results cannot be taken as prescriptive. However, they are powerfully inductive and may lead managers and government leaders to new insights and may reveal unsuspected interdependency of factors or levers for policy. Right on, Giulio. You said it better than I could answer it. So it's a good point, and I don't think it's a question. I just strongly agree with you. Bruce Crawford, as the implementation of national security-related AI use cases transition from a government-operated function to a series of commercially provided services, what do you think will be the core areas for provision of AI-related services going forward? Yeah, I know this is it's a really interesting question on what this looks like in the future. Our lessons learned in Maven that I carried over with the Jake, and also I would say that Nand as the CTO not only didn't dissuade me from my ideas, but encouraged them, which was finding that commercial technology solution that can be adapted for the IC or DoD needs. You're in essence buying a product somewhat off the shelf that then has to be adapted in some ways, substantially adapted for either IC or DoD needs. That then changes the end product and becomes a question of, who owns what, who owns the intellectual property, who owns the licensing, who owns the algorithm once it's been trained against government data, all those things that we had to address in our contracts and IP discussions that we had. The question of who's provisioning AI-related services, I'll give one example for that is the Joint Common Foundation that the Jake is standing up. And now, finally, JEDI still hasn't been solved as an enterprise cloud solution for the DoD, but the Joint Common Foundation is designed to allow the Jake to provision those services. So there'll be an enterprise-wide cloud platform on top of which the Joint Common Foundation will be an AI platform, allowing anybody to come in and get access to the data they need, the tools they need, the AI services they need, R, Python, on and on. They can get it through the JCF. It doesn't replace a lot of the other things that are out there, but it makes it more of a one-stop shopping, similar to what you see a lot of companies doing today. Amazon, Microsoft, you can go out and sort of one-stop shop your way from everything from a data labeling solution all the way up to running high-level compute and coming out with a solution that they'll help you help you productize. So the Jake can help do that. What I don't want to do is be beholden to any single solution on anything. So I think it's important that there is an honest broker that's looking at these provision services and not just going after a single company because they happen to do one thing better than anybody else. I want to have that one thing better than anybody else multiplied by 100 and give access to everybody having access to the same tools. The reason I always supported it, despite some resistance, natural resistance, I guess, by some people about a centralized foundation at the OSD level, is exactly this reason. Because the services were all going out and rolling their own, doing what I would call the county options, and not doing really that well at doing it because it's hard work. It sounds great, it sounds easy until you actually do a project or two. You find out how incredibly hard it is. So the idea of a common foundation to make those services available to everybody else, to make the acquisition and contracting solution available to everybody else, that should not be something anybody should have to go reinvent the wheel on ever again. It's too complicated. So it's really about having somebody that can work the provision of services, but of course there will still be big government parts of the solution in there. Yep, sorry, got the, no, yep, there you go. Keeping up with this is from Chris Hoofnagel. Keeping up with the people challenge, I'd like to encourage my students to work with you, yet the clearance process is both quite a burden and an unattractive alternative to private sector employment Silicon Valley firms with high pay and no fuss about personal activities. Do you see ways the clearance process could be liberalized or passed for private sector participants to consult/work for shorter periods without the commitment that full employment requires? Oh yeah, it's hard, right? Especially for the IC, right? DoD was hard enough. The IC, it is harder. I will not deny that. But we also have to find a way to break through it. There was a whole initiative as part of, I think, not just AIM iHub, but broader what they were trying to do, Sue Gordon was trying to do over at the DNI, which was security clearance reform. They've made a lot of progress. Honestly, made a lot of progress. It's still not fast enough. My personal example is the CTO. He comes from a family background where a lot of overseas time, and it cost him a year in his security clearance. A year as the CTO. Now, could he still sit down with me and whiteboard all the great stuff that he whiteboarded with me every single day to get me smarter on how to do business? Yes, but what he wasn't doing was getting into the real product work of warfighter requirements. This is where the big difference came in. Once he got that security clearance and understand these acronym called JADC2, and nobody quite understands what that is, but he got a pretty good feel of it once he got a security clearance. Now he was able to start tailoring his solution, this to Jake's solution towards that problem set. There has to be a better way. And there's plenty of work to go around that does not need a top secret SI, super sensitive security clearance. And Dwayne, Davey may get into this a little bit because a lot of this open source requires no security clearance whatsoever. The dark web stuff, why aren't we bringing that in more on intelligence? People shy away from it, probably the next big area to get some good intelligence analysis out of. So it's one that's a constant battle. And I'll tell you, it's such a problem that they've put a whole organization against this at Defense Security Service to get better at security clearance reform. But it's tough, and there are going to have to be some waivers granted because of some people's personal activities that will raise flags in the system, the dreaded system. But it's doable, but it's hard. Jim Cox, how widely collaborative are all these great initiatives? Are Five Eye allies integrated into research and work? Yeah, I love that question. Little known fact, when I was doing Project Maven, I made a decision that nobody questioned me on. I assumed I had the authority to do it. And to this day, I'm not sure I did, but I made it a Five Eyes initiative and brought the Five Eyes in from the very beginning. And the reason I did that was not because I was thinking ahead, because a very aggressive intel officer that some of you on this call will know very well, Osby, beat the living crap out of me by essentially saying to me in a meeting one day, we briefed him and bragged about Project Maven. And he looked at me in the eye and he said, Jack, this is what happened to us in eyesight. The IC was 2, 3, 4 years down the road, turned around and said, where are my Five Eye partners? Why aren't you there with us? Don't effing let that happen to us, mate. Almost a direct quote. And he was right. So from that point on, I made it a Five Eyes initiative because of that experience. And of course, New Zealand's in a different place than Canada, than is a different place than Australia, different place in the UK. But it doesn't matter. They're all willing to move forward. So when I stood up the Jake, one of the things I really focused on, what they think they call it today, is partnership for defense. Building part of the organization just focused on this. And the last meeting I saw that they held a few months ago, I think I had somewhere between 11 and 15 different companies, and not all the traditional companies or countries that the Department of Defense works with. Singapore, Israel, the Baltic countries are all doing some of the most cutting edge work in the world on AI. Why not bring them in? So it's getting better. It's hard. Again, I did not have a way. I had the authority to share data in many cases, if not all cases, with the Five Eyes. I didn't have a mechanism for doing so. It was crazy. We didn't have a common place where we can go in and get the data because the data was too big for the systems that were put in place to share data between the Five Eyes. Yeah, it's absurd, but those are the hard sort of grunt work problems that have to be dealt with day in and day out. But this is a little bit about illiberal authoritarian use of AI in places like China against the rest of the world. And if we're not there with the rest of the world and trying to do this as the US on its own, it is a losing proposition. That is a unpaid editorial comment, but one I will stick with to 6 feet under the ground. Okay, Kevin Sullivan, I got a couple of minutes left. I'll get to as much as I can. Kevin Sullivan, University of Virginia. There remains some profound technical challenges in AI, including one, development of effective DNN solutions is as much art as science engineering. We are not able to rigorously verify that trained large-scale models have critical behavioral properties. While technology is not the only blocker for effective adoption and use of AI, there do remain some significant issues. Yes, you're correct. Which of these issues or any are top of the mind in the IC and DoD leadership? Are there proxy problems that academics are working on or could work on to address these issues? The security and life criticality of DoD IC applications of AI puts a higher premium on trustworthiness than one will often face in industry, for example, in advertising. Agree. Well said. I will agree enthusiastically with everything I just read in the Q&A box. And so it's so important to me. Again, here's where we learned probably as much as anything else in the early days of Maven, which was test and evaluation, validation, and verification. It existed in commercial industry, but it was not what we needed to be able to put a system in use for warfighter operations. That does bring a different threshold. Now, I've been challenged on that, by the way, by people saying, now, come on, do you not think that when you're putting software in automated or autonomous vehicles, that they're not doing the equivalent test and evaluation? I'd say yes and no. I think for a lot of the software that's put out, say, as Nand, my CTO, used to say all the time, a bad movie recommendation on Netflix is just that. A bad algorithm on an airplane is a life and death failure. So T&E and V&V was so important to me every single day in the JAIC. Dr. Jane Pinellas, who's another University of Michigan grad at the PhD level, is the person running this for the JAIC. And she's built a community of interest that includes a lot of people from academia. So if you're interested in this, Jane would love to have more people join in. There are lots and lots of proxy problems to work on. Humanitarian assistance and disaster relief may be the best one of all, because so much of that is fungible in terms of other mission sets the department has. Natural language processing, SIGINT, same kind of thing, right? If I'm trying to listen to what the drug dealers are saying in Spanish slang, natural language processing has improved inordinate amounts over the past decade, thanks to NSA and others. But there's also proxy problems that have helped advance the cause pretty fast. So TEV&V, when we're talking about placing AI-enabled capabilities into autonomous systems, that does bring, to me, a level of gravity that demands we really approach this seriously. So I agree with what you say, and the good news is it is being worked. It's being worked hard, and in some ways, I think the Department of Defense is going to lead the way. The IC, the diffuse nature of AIM iHub is a little bit different. I think you got individual agency solutions that need to do T&E. What I want to see and always wanted to see out of JAIC is a centralized T&E solution that anybody could come in and learn from. All sorts of different frameworks that could be adopted for whatever technology you were trying to bring into an individual service. Yeah, okay. So Rebecca, yeah, I'll read this because she makes a number of important points. We need to encourage individuals in bureaucracy to find the people who are advocates. Yes, the bureaucracy does not disappear, never, but the product information, other products will begin to come interwoven in the structure. Right on. What we need is more education of the users of the technological advances in AI. The issue is how can we effectively do this education with limited budgets that eliminate education? Yeah, so there's a number of things there before I even get to your second paragraph. One is, yes, it's zero-sum a lot of these places in education and training. You want me to do it more on AI or coding or agile? What comes out? Well, we've got to do it, so we have to find a way to get this right. The idea is education of the users. I used to think about this pretty much every day. The worlds of technologists and sort of philosophers diverged when they were, I think, closer together in the 50s and 60s. They need to come back together again. The philosophers need to understand what the practical applications are they need to be thinking about. I love pie in the sky is wonderful, has to be done. I love it. I'll read those things till I'm blue in the face. But they have to understand what these technologies are doing. And to your point, the people using the technology have to understand the societal implications. As I like to say, I 100% confidence that 15 years ago in his dorm room at Harvard, Mark Zuckerberg did not assume he would be in front of Congress one day explaining why his company violated all sorts of privacy and ethical rules in the United States. He never expected that. He was not standing up his company to do anything but make a lot of money and sort of bring new technology to the United States. These are questions that we had better be addressing. We saw the really bad parts of this, the malign influence and disinformation, misinformation, GPT-3 showing sort of what the future could look like, and it may not be as pretty as we would like it to believe. So technologists and philosophers coming together in a better way, or ethicists or lawyers too. Also, we must be careful, she says. We speak of product management and agile as interchangeable. They're not, but they can be complementary. Correct. So I take your point on that one. And I think my alarm is going off, which tells me I'm out of time. And I think I hit all of them, but ethics is a separate one that would take a whole day one. So I see Sujit asked a question on that. So Joe, over to you. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you, Jack, for that very cogent and passionate description of the challenges that we face moving forward.